Buddhism for Today, The Essential Wisdom of the Threefold Lotus Sutra by Nikkyo Niwano. Part 2, The Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma. Chapter 7, The Parable of the Conjured City. The Three Rounds of Teaching. Shakyamuni Buddha used three methods to teach the Dharma, collectively known as the Three Rounds of Teaching the Dharma. The first entailed teaching the Dharma in abstract theoretical terms, known as teaching by theory. If the Buddha saw that his listeners weren't grasping his teaching, he would shift to more easily understood allegorical stories containing metaphors and figurative expressions, a method called teaching by parable. If his listeners were still unable to grasp the true meaning of his exposition, the Buddha would use the method of teaching by recounting causal connections, which means showing people that they can become Buddhas by revealing that their future attainment of Buddhahood stems from their encounters with a Buddha in their former lives. The Lotus Sutra uses all three of these methods so that anyone can understand the teachings, which contributes to the sutra's magnificence. This chapter, The Parable of the Conjured City, falls into the category of teaching by recounting causal connections. It begins with the Buddha revealing the relationship between him and his disciples from the remotest past. At the conclusion of chapter 6, the world-honored one told his disciples, "I will now reveal the events of our past lifetimes that connect us all. Listen well." With this lead-in, the Buddha begins the new Dharma exposition that this chapter comprises. In the remotest past, there was a Buddha known as Universal Surpassing Wisdom Tathagata, whose domain was called well-realized and whose era was designated great attributes. An inexpressibly long time has passed since that Buddha entered nirvana. To explain this span of time using a metaphor, suppose that someone ground this whole world down into fine particles like powdered ink. That person then passes through 1,000 lands in an eastern direction of the universe, and drops one particle as small as a grain of dust. Then, passing through another 1,000 lands, he lets another grain fall. Suppose he continues like this until all the powder he made of our world is exhausted. Could you possibly count the number of lands that he passed through? Would it be possible for even mathematicians to calculate their number? 1,000 lands means all the heavenly bodies in a galaxy. Imagine that one grain of the powder made from our world was dropped at a star, and another grain was dropped after passing another cluster of 1,000 years. When asked how many galaxies this would amount to, all the monks gave a sigh and answered that it is impossible to know the number. The world-honored one nods in agreement and continues his exposition. Now suppose that all those lands that the man passed through, and even those he did not, were all ground to dust, and imagine that each particle of dust is the equivalent of one kalpa, an extremely long unit of time lasting from hundreds of millions to billions of years. Can you imagine the length of time equal to the number of all those particles of dust? The time since Universal Surpassing Wisdom Tathagata entered nirvana far exceeds the number of those kalpas by immeasurable, innumerable, hundreds of thousands of millions of myriads. But through the power of the Tathagata's knowledge and insight, I can perceive that extremely long span of time as if it were today. The Buddha used this metaphor of a world ground to dust, with each particle dropped at consecutive clusters of stars, in order to give his disciples a sense of what we would call infinity or eternity. We can't wrap our minds around the concept of infinity unless we have some finite standard for comparison. Even if we try to imagine the boundlessness of heavens by looking up at the cloudless blue sky, it may still be difficult. But if we see a tiny wisp of a cloud floating at a high altitude, this allows us to sense something of the sky's vastness. We can get an even better sense of infinity by gazing up into the starry night sky. Light travels 7.5 times the circumference of the earth in just a second, and the distance it can travel in a year at this immense speed is called a light year. The stars you see when you look up at the sky are hundreds of thousands of light years away from us. Some are even hundreds of millions of light years distant, and there are some that are farther away still. The sense of wonder we experience gazing at starry skies really brings the notion of infinity home to us. This is exactly how Shakyamuni Buddha's method of guiding living beings leads us to realize the true meaning of the Dharma. We cannot speak highly enough of the ways the Buddha teaches us by using his practical yet profound wisdom. The meaning of today. In the final analysis, the Buddha's words, "I can perceive that extremely long span of time as if it were today," suggest to us that cultivating religious practice to become a Buddha is not something that is confined to this life alone, but is an infinite journey. Furthermore, when we firmly grasp that all living beings practice continually from the infinite past into the infinite future in order to become Buddhas, our today ceases to exist in isolation, separate from a larger whole, and we realize that the here and now is not all there is to existence. The Buddha's words implicitly direct us to awaken to the truth that our today is but a single deep pool or one shoal in the endless river of practice that flows continuously from the infinite past into the infinite future. Accordingly, we must ask ourselves what kind of negative effects the defiling of our minds and bodies today will exert downstream on our river of infinite spiritual practice which flows continuously through time. We should also carefully consider how the lower reaches of the river will change for the better if we are able to purify our bodies and minds in this life. The World-Honored One has an extremely profound motive for surprising his disciples by telling them he can perceive that extremely long span of time as if it were today. Next, he reveals the events in the lifetime of a Buddha from the distant past. We should keep this in mind as we proceed with the discussion of the chapter. The Buddha restates what he said in verse and then, returning to prose, continues. The lifetime of the Buddha, universal surpassing wisdom, spanned 540,000 million myriads of kalpas. This Buddha thought he was on the verge of supreme perfect awakening when he first sat in meditation at the place of the way and defeated the armies of Mara that had come to impede him. But that remaining single step to supreme perfect awakening was exceedingly difficult. He sat there, immovable for 100,000 years, continuing his practice. Even so, the Buddha Dharma was not revealed to him. At that time, the heavenly beings from Indra's domain, at the summit of the heavenly realms, called Triyastrimsha heaven, prepared a lion-seat throne under a Bodhi tree for the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom. It was 1 yojana high, in altitude of several kilometers, and the heavenly being said to that Buddha, "Please sit on this throne in order to realize supreme perfect awakening." As soon as that Buddha took his seat, the heavenly beings rained down beautiful celestial flowers all around him. When those flowers had accumulated high around that Buddha, the heavenly beings caused a fragrant breeze to blow away all the withered flowers so that they could rain fresh ones anew. In this fashion, the heavenly beings continued their offerings to that Buddha for 100,000 years. There are 4 heavenly kings, sustainer of the domain, facilitator of growth, viewer of all, and hearer of many, who protect Buddhism and safeguard the whole world in its eastern, southern, western, and northern quadrants. The heavenly beings at the service of those 4 heavenly kings constantly beat heavenly drums, and other heavenly beings performed homage with celestial music for a full 100,000 years, continuing to do so until that Buddha attained supreme perfect awakening. This description shows that the heavenly beings waited in eager anticipation for the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom to attain supreme perfect awakening, and that they offered him their devotion and admiration. The image of fragrant breezes sweeping away withered flowers, to be replaced by new showers of fresh blossoms, indicates that their hopes, devotion, and admiration continued for all time. The Buddha continues, the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom continued practicing unflaggingly in this way for a long period of time, finally achieving the state of Buddhahood. This point is extremely important, and you should take it firmly to heart. Before that Buddha left home, he was a prince and already the father of 16 sons, the eldest of whom was named Accumulation of Wisdom. The sons possessed various kinds of rare toys and were leading happy lives, but when they heard that their father had become a Buddha, they decided to go and cultivate spiritual practice under his guidance, after which they threw away their beloved toys and renounced home life. Their mother saw them off with tears because they feared the sons would never again return home. Their grandfather, a monarch of extremely eminent virtue, and therefore known as a wheel-rolling sage king, joined his grandsons and, accompanied by a great many ministers and citizens, they made their way to the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom. After making various offerings to that Buddha, they paid homage to him by kneeling down and touching their foreheads to his feet. Next, they offered the highest gesture of respect by walking in procession around him, and then they respectfully placed their palms together single-mindedly, and while gazing up at him, they praised that Buddha with verse in this manner. Buddha, although you are once an ordinary being who lived alongside us, you have spent an infinite amount of time practicing in order to liberate living beings, and here in this place you have become a Buddha. Your figure is truly exalted. When we revere you, it gives us hope that we, too, can become Buddhas according to our cultivation of practice, and this brings us joy we have never known. Living beings are continually suffering in distress. They don't know how to free themselves because they have had no one to guide them, and so their delusion has steadily worsened. But now The Buddha is free from all delusion and has attained the state of peace and comfort. You are an example for humans and heavenly beings, showing them how to receive the teachings of a Buddha and attain awakening. This is the most delightful good fortune. All of us have faith in and rely on the Buddha. We ask you to teach and guide us. Next, the 16 sons of the Buddha, universal surpassing wisdom, also praise him in verse and beg him 3 times in succession to roll the wheel of the Dharma for living beings. To roll the wheel of the Dharma means to expound teachings in accord with the truth, which is Buddhism. Once a Buddha has given teachings, they are transmitted from one person to another, just like a wheel that rolls endlessly. Shakyamuni Buddha then continues in a more serious tone. When the Buddha, universal surpassing wisdom, attained supreme perfect awakening, each of the 500,000 million Buddha worlds in all directions was shaken in various ways, and even the realms of darkness between those worlds, where the light of sun and moons could not reach, were brilliantly illuminated. The living beings in those realms of darkness, who had all assumed that they each existed in isolation, became visible to one another, and, mystified, they all exclaimed in wonder, "Where did all these other living beings suddenly come from?" Emancipation from the hell of isolation. The phrase, realms of darkness, mentioned above, calls for further explanation. In places where the teachings of the Buddhas do not circulate, living beings become antagonistic toward one another, and they are unable to open their hearts to each other. Parents and children, or brothers and sisters, live together in name only. Their hearts are actually isolated from one another. They endure lonely lives in which they have no one to depend on except themselves. Once the teachings of the Buddha spread in those places, however, people become close friends, and the relationship of siblings becomes harmonious. Formerly isolated and lonely people immediately become happy and surrounded by many good friends. This is the significance of the sudden ability of the living beings in the realms of darkness to see multitudes of other beings all around them. Shakyamuni Buddha continues, "The palaces of the heavenly beings of all those Buddha worlds also shook in various ways, and a great light, surpassing even the brilliance of the suns and moons, illuminated them. Then the palaces of the Brahma heavens in the eastward quadrant of the universe were also illuminated to twice their normal brightness. The Brahma heavenly kings thought, 'Why have our palaces been illuminated by a light the likes of which we have never seen before?' And they gathered to confer with one another. Meanwhile, there was a great Brahma heavenly king among them named Liberator of All, who addressed the gathered Brahma heavenly kings in verse, expressing the following meaning. Why has a brilliant light, unlike anything we have ever experienced, illuminated our palaces? Why don't we investigate this together? Perhaps it is a sign of the birth of a heavenly being of eminent virtue, or it could be that a Buddha has appeared in the world. Why has this immense light illuminated all directions of the universe?" Then the Brahma heavenly kings, seated just as they were in their palaces, traveled toward the western quarter of the universe to search for the source of the great light, taking with them baskets overflowing with celestial flowers. When they arrived at the place of the way, where the Buddha, universal surpassing wisdom, sat atop the lion seat, they found him surrounded and revered by the 8 classes of guardians, including heavenly beings, dragon kings, Gandharvas, Kimnaras, and Maharagas, as well as human and non-humans, and beings from many other worlds. The 16 princes were also there, beseeching the Buddha to expound the Dharma. When the Brahma heavenly kings beheld this scene, they immediately paid homage to the Buddha by bowing at his feet, made procession round and round him hundreds of thousands of times, and then strewed their celestial flowers over him until the accumulated flowers rose as high as the summit of Mount Sumeru. The Brahma heavenly kings also made offerings to the Bodhi tree that stood next to the lion seat at the place of the way. After they completed their offerings of celestial flowers, the Brahma heavenly kings also offered their palaces, beseeching the Buddha, "Please accept the offerings of our palaces out of your heartfelt compassion for us." Making offerings is action that expresses both our faith in and reliance on the Buddha and our heartfelt gratitude. The fact that the Brahma heavenly kings go so far as to make offerings to the Bodhi tree also holds profound implications. The Bodhi tree protected the meditating Buddha-to-be from the hot Indian sun by sheltering him with shade, making the ground under its branches a natural place to the way where he could attain enlightenment. Living beings who have deep faith in and rely on a Buddha make offerings not only to that world-honored one, but also to those who protect that Buddha, or the place of the way where the teachings are practiced. The Buddha continues, "At this time all the Brahma heavenly kings spoke in verse before the Buddha with a single voice. A Buddha rarely appears in the world, and it is extremely difficult to encounter one. He embodies infinite merits and is able to liberate all living beings. He is a great teacher of both heavenly and human beings, for whom he has compassion, teaches, and leads all beings in the world. All living beings in the universe hear his teachings and receive benefits from them. We have gathered from various heavenly domains, leaving the quiet and peaceful meditative life of the heavenly realms, to come here for the sake of making offerings to the Buddha Universal Surpassing Wisdom. Our palaces are wonderfully adorned because of the blessings from our previous lifetimes. We now offer them to the World-Honored One and pray that he will know our hearts and see fit to accept them. Creation is the joy of human life. In the passage above, the Brahma heavenly kings purposely abandoned their quiet and peaceful meditative lives to descend to the human realm for the sake of receiving the Buddha Universal Surpassing Wisdom's instruction. This significant point is at the very core of the Lotus Sutra's teachings, and so it deserves careful consideration. A comfortable existence of peace and security is not the only thing to live for. A purposeful life also includes engaging in the act of creation by bringing good into the world. When we try to make ourselves better people through cultivating spiritual practice, this endeavor is the creation of good. When we undertake action for the sake of others, it is the creation of a higher standard of good. The various arts are all endeavors in the creation of beauty, and in fact, all people working in professions beneficial to society create various kinds of positive energy. Creation inevitably also involves pain and hardship, but the meaning of life is found precisely in our painstaking efforts in the struggles we face for the sake of the good. Within the process of striving to become a better person and endeavoring to be more beneficial to others, we find the profound joy of human life. If we lived in a world without the hardships and joys of creation, we would quickly grow bored with such a life. Not tiring of such an existence is the very definition of laziness. Even if people who are mired in delusion were for some reason to rise to the heavenly realms, they would likely soon plunge downward again, falling into the realms of asuras or hells. Heavenly beings have attained both physical and emotional peace and comfort. But as long as even one person is still suffering in the world, if heavenly beings do not experience a heartfelt desire to help that lone sufferer, and fail to take initiative to assist the Buddha's work of emancipation, they will not be able to ascend to the realm of Buddhas, the highest state of all existence. Even for heavenly beings, the difficulty and effort of exerting themselves for others, bringing joy to others, and helping to liberate others from their sufferings is the true source of joy in life, the way by which they can attain the enlightenment of the Buddhas. As illustrated by the diagram of the 10 realms of living beings on page 153, the path to enter the realm of Buddha starts from the realm of human beings. This is the point the Japanese monk Nichiren was making when he famously said, 100 years' practice in the Pure Land is not equal to the merit of a single day's practice in an impure land. Unless heavenly beings continually descend to the world of humans to work for the liberation of others, they cannot become Buddhas. For this profound reason, the Brahma heavenly kings purposely descended from their celestial worlds of peace and ease and abandoned their palaces, symbolic of a lifestyle or environment of peaceful tranquility, desiring to devote themselves to the teachings of the Buddha. Then the Brahma heavenly kings from the rest of the universe gathered. They came from the southeastern, southern, southwestern, western, northwestern, northern, and northeastern quarters, as well as the directions of the nadir and zenith, and all made the same request to the Buddha. Here, as in other sutras, similar scenes are repeated, but as explained previously, when reciting sutras, we should concentrate wholeheartedly on the recitation of even such repetitive passages. The universal transfer of merit. The end of the 14th section of verse in this chapter includes the following lines spoken by the Brahma heavenly kings. May these merits extend universally to all, so that we and all living beings together accomplish the Buddha way. These lines are known collectively as the universal transfer of merit and also as the closing verse of vows, because in addition to devotees of the Lotus Sutra, many practitioners of various other types of Mahayana Buddhism recite this passage as a conclusion to their sutra chanting services. These short lines also give perfect expression to the spirit of the vow that every Buddhist makes, and they also epitomize all the practices that Buddhists undertake. May these merits means with the merits that we acquire from making this offering to the Buddhas. This does not imply that the Brahma heavenly kings desire to receive something in compensation for having presented their palaces to the Buddha Universal Surpassing Wisdom. The Buddhas do not desire material things. Making offerings to the Buddhas with flowers or food is an expression of our faith in and reliance on the Buddhas, as well as our gratitude. But making offerings to the Buddhas through the cultivation of practice is the most important because it means casting aside our selfish ego, the small self, Atman, and practicing the Buddha way. Reciting the sutra in front of an altar that enshrines the Buddha is one of the practices of first forgetting and finally abandoning our selfish ego. To that end, offering sutra recitation is a magnificent way of honoring the Buddha. Honoring the Buddha in various ways, including offering sutra recitation, should not be performed merely for the sake of one's own peace and comfort, or only to pray for stability and ease in making our livelihoods. We should honor the Buddha with the heartfelt desire that the merit of our offerings in various forms of practice extend universally to all living beings. Our prayer should be that we, along with all living beings, accomplish the Buddha way. Because the universal transfer of merit carries this profound significance, we should recite it not mechanically, but earnestly as the great vow made by all disciples of the Buddha. When the 16 princes and the Brahma heavenly kings, who had descended from the celestial realms throughout the universe, asked the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom to teach the Dharma, that Buddha responded to their appeal by explaining the Four Noble Truths in detail, using a method called the Three Dimensions of Teaching. The three dimensions of teaching the Four Noble Truths are, first, showing, which means demonstrating the principle of the Four Noble Truths by using practical examples from real life, also called the indicative dimension. Second, encouraging, which entails urging people to practice the Four Noble Truths, also called the exhortative dimension. And third, verifying, which provides concrete examples that verify that the Buddha has actually realized as well as accomplished the Four Noble Truths, also called the evidential dimension. The Buddha Universal Surpassing Wisdom used these three ways of expounding the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, and consequently, this passage of the sutra states, he rolled the Dharma wheel in 12 phases, that is, the three dimensions of each of the Four Noble Truths. Since the Four Noble Truths have already been discussed in detail on pages 67 to 68, here I will now explore the 12 causes and conditions, a core teaching of Buddhism that the Buddha Universal Surpassing Wisdom introduces next. The 12 causes and conditions. Outer causation. The 12 causes and conditions, also called the 12 links of dependent origination, explain that all phenomena are constantly changing, arising, and perishing, and that all change occurs according to the principle of dependent origination, pratitya samutpada. While all things are transient, this principle itself remains constant. It is called the 12 causes and conditions because it is divided into 12 stages. Although the scope of this principle applies to all phenomena in existence, the 12 causes and conditions will be easier to grasp if we apply it to our own human existence. The Buddha expounded the 12 causes and conditions in detail to Ananda in the long discourses. They explained the coming into existence and development of the human body, called outer causation, and the development of our mental states, known as inner causation. The former explains the process of birth, growth, and aging and death of human beings across the three temporal states of the past, present, and future. The latter shows how our minds change and provides a basic method for purifying them and freeing ourselves from delusion. The 12 stages, or links, as they are sometimes called, are 1. Ignorance, 2. Action, 3. Consciousness, 4. Name and form, or mental functioning in physical matter, 5. The 6 senses, 6. Contact, 7. Sensation, 8. Craving, 9. Clinging, 10. Existence, 11. Birth, and 12. Aging and death. First, by examining outer causation, we will consider people's physical birth, their growth, aging and death, and finally how they transmigrate. The first link of the 12 causes and conditions is ignorance. Ignorance is written using a combination of Chinese characters that literally mean no light. This is a figurative way of indicating the absence of wisdom. The lack of wisdom is ignorance, the fundamental underlying cause of our actions. Both our actions and the effect they leave behind are commonly called karma. Strictly speaking, karma means deed, an action that is undertaken with a particular will, motive, or purpose. All our intentional actions are karma. But any deed is invariably accompanied by a result, which we also refer to with the term karma. The karma produced in our past lives remains, resting in the depths of our mind like seeds, and it is the reason we have wandered in samsara, that is, transmigrated through repeated rebirths since the infinite past. It is because of this fundamental ignorance that we repeat unwholesome actions again and again. Karmic seeds that were caused by our past ignorant actions enter the womb at conception, producing consciousness. Consciousness is the cognitive functioning that is the essential nature of living beings. A human-like being, though still a fetus and not completely developed, is created by the presence of consciousness. As it gradually develops and takes shape, it becomes name and form. Name refers to the immaterial aspect, or mental functioning, while form means its physical human body, or physical matter. Next, we develop the 5 sense organs, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, as well as the mind, which discerns the phenomena that our sense organs perceive. At this point, we are still within the womb, and our sensory capacities are incomplete. But because the functioning of our mind-body is now at the stage of diverging into 6 different senses, this stage is called the 6 senses, or 6 entrances. We are born into the world at this stage of the 6 senses, and they reach complete development at about the age of 2 or 3, when full sensory perception is achieved. We are able to see shapes and colors, hear sounds, and detect smells, tastes, and physical sensations. This stage is called contact. When the capabilities of these faculties to distinguish things are further developed, feelings of like and dislike naturally appear. This is called sensation. When we can distinguish these various feelings of like and dislike, craving results. Craving, also called desire, implies many things, but here we will limit its meaning to the physical human body and understand it as meaning sexual desire. As this desire becomes stronger, lust arises, which is the longing for another person. This is clinging. Later, if we enter into cohabitation with a partner, this stage is existence. In the course of time, we may have children who are living beings that, just like us, are propelled by their karma to be reborn in this world. Once we reach adulthood, suffering in the truest sense begins to assault us in various ways. Since this is the culmination of human development in the cycle of outer causation, it is considered birth. This stage continues through life, and we finally come to aging and death. Clinical research has shown that during the approximately 9 months from the moment of conception to the delivery of the fully formed human child, the body passes through something resembling the 2 billion year process of human evolution from amoeba-like single-celled organism to modern human being. In other words, when first conceived, a modern Homo sapien resembles the single-celled organism of 2 billion years ago. The Buddha's teaching of the 12 causes and conditions so closely resembles the account of modern science that we cannot but be impressed. Transmigration. What happens after we die? Buddhism teaches that the deepest layers of our consciousness, which contains the karmic seeds sown by our actions, remains in this world for a period of time in the state of intermediate existence after death. And when this time is over, we are reborn in an appropriate world in accordance with the karma we have accumulated in our previous lives. Buddhism, particularly traditions closely associated with the Lotus Sutra, divides the universe into 10 modes of existence, called the 10 realms: hells, hungry spirits, beasts, asuras, human beings, heavens, Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas, as on the diagram on page 153. If we die unawakened, we will be reborn in one of the 6 worlds of delusion and suffering, also known as the 6 realms of existence, in accordance with our karma, which leads again to aging and death through the cycle of 12 stages described above. We will continually repeat this cycle of rebirth. The perpetual repetition of birth and death is called transmigration, samsara. However, if we encounter the Buddha Dharma and accumulate a great deal of wholesome karma by practicing the Bodhisattva way, we will be able to achieve birth in a better world by purifying our unwholesome karma. Karma. At this juncture, we should discuss karma in greater depth to help us better understand the 12 causes and conditions. As mentioned above, karma means deed, an action that is undertaken with a particular will, motive, or purpose. All our intentional actions are karma. Any deed is invariably accompanied by a result, which we also refer to as karma. Who we are at this moment is the result of karma, the consequence of our deeds in all our past lives. For example, the fact that you are reading this book at this moment is the result of the causes and conditions created by the accumulation of various past deeds. Although each person's circumstances differ, the result of various past deeds has produced your present circumstances. The results of our past deeds have long-term implications, a remainder called a reward or sometimes recompense. Karma is a complex and serious matter. Our deeds, however trivial, leave behind physical, mental, and environmental traces. Traces left in our minds include memory, knowledge, habits, intelligence, and personality, which are the product of our experiences and deeds accumulated over a long period of time. The traces our deeds leave on our bodies are apparent to everyone. For instance, when overeating or excessive drinking leads to sickness, or conversely, when the proper amount of exercise leaves us healthy and physically fit. Our attitudes are expressed in our bodies. The most obvious are facial expressions. You will notice that the face of a mean-spirited person may express a hardness, no matter how handsome or beautiful they may be. The expression of someone who is always angry eventually shows a grimness. The face of a gentle, knowledgeable, dignified, or virtuous person often expresses happiness, acuity, and respect for others. In short, over time, people naturally tend to outwardly manifest their mindsets through their expressions. This is how I understand what Abraham Lincoln meant when he famously said, "Every man over 40 is responsible for his face." Part of the traces left behind by the activity of our minds, that is, mental karma, as well as our deeds, remains on the mind surface, including the aforementioned memory, knowledge, habits, intelligence, and personality. Another portion rests within the subconscious, in the hidden depths of our mind. Moreover, all the influences of the outer world that have gone unnoticed by us, and all our experiences we had before our birth in this lifetime, indeed, ever since the evolution of human beings, lie submerged in our subconscious mind. Karma, in this sense, as the lingering effects of action, karmic seeds, includes all of these influences. Although I defined it above simply as our deeds, the word karma can also be used to mean the accumulation of all our experiences and deeds since the dawn of humanity, if not before. This is known as karma from previous lifetimes. The workings of this karma are called the power of karma. What does the concept of karma teach us? We sometimes come across people who say, "I never asked my parents to bring me into this world," or "I am not responsible for my brain, temperament, and physique because I inherited them from my parents." While there seems to be some logic in this view, this is actually a misguided way of looking at it. It is undeniable that parents and ancestors are partially responsible for the makeup of their descendants, but the greater part is the responsibility of the descendants themselves. Although a portion of our present self is the result of the biological inheritance from our parents and ancestors, who we are is mostly the result of the karma we ourselves produced in previous lifetimes. Moreover, the self that exists after childhood is the consequence of karma that we have produced ourselves in this lifetime. So the responsibility of our parents is quite limited. The concept of karma teaches us that we reap the fruits of what we ourselves have sown. Placing the responsibility for what we have become on others inevitably leads to grievances and frustration. But if we consider our present situation to be the result of our own past deeds, we can be at peace with our present circumstances, while at the same time gaining confidence in our future. We can do so because we realize that the more wholesome the karma we accumulate, the happier we will become, and the better the reward that we receive. This realization motivates us to accumulate much wholesome karma in the future. This is not an issue just for our present lives in this world. The mechanism of karma gives us hope for our future lives after our learning in this world has come to an end. For many people who have no spiritual beliefs, nothing is as terrifying as death. Whether they admit it or not, most people fear death. But if we have an awareness of the workings of karmic consequences, when death inevitably comes, we will be able to retain our composure because we have great hopes for our future life. The problem of the type of karma we accumulate is not limited to us. When we reflect that our actions exert great influence on other people and our descendants, we naturally feel a sense of responsibility for our actions. If parents are to exert a good influence akin to a karmic consequence or reward on their children, it is important that the parents maintain a positive attitude toward life. When parents understand this, they resolve to speak to their children using appropriate language and raise them with both proper discipline and affection. The term karmic consequences is often regarded with a sense of doom and gloom because it has been both taught and understood incorrectly. Rather, we should think of karmic consequences or rewards in positive and optimistic terms as outlined above. Inner causation. Now we will explore the 12 causes and conditions as applied to the changing states of a human being's mind. This is referred to as inner causation. Ignorance, the first link, was explained previously as the absence of wisdom, which means not having a proper view of the world and human life, or disregarding the proper view even when one is actually aware of it. Because of ignorance, we have behaved since the infinite past in ways that deviate from universal truth. And these deeds are actions, the second link. In this case, actions should be interpreted not only as one's own actions in this life, but as the accumulation of experiences and actions over an immense span of time, as explained above in the discussion of karma. In the case of inner causation, consciousness, the third link, is our awareness and perception. It is the fundamental power or function by which living beings discern everything in the world around them. All the capabilities and the functioning of consciousness are determined by the accumulation of one's experiences and deeds of the past. In other words, the karma that one has produced. Name and form is the fourth link. As explained before, name refers to intangible phenomena or mental functioning, whereas form means the tangible forms of our physical bodies. Name and form together compose the entirety of our existence. The words consciousness causes name and form in this chapter of the sutra means that through consciousness we living beings have a sense of our own existence. Without it, we would not be aware of ourselves. Next comes the fifth link, the six senses. In the case of inner causation, this indicates the functioning of our six sense faculties. To reiterate what was explained above, the six senses are the functioning of the six sense organs: eyes, sight, ears, hearing, nose, smell, tongue, taste, body, touch, and finally mind, cognition, the sixth sense faculty, which processes the various phenomena perceived by the other five senses. Although we are vaguely aware of our own name and form, our own existence, through consciousness, this level of awareness is not clear enough to be true knowledge. But when the five functions of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, as well as the mind which recognizes things, all join to work together, we are able to discern things clearly. This stage is called contact, the sixth link. There are several differing interpretations of this stage. According to one interpretation, contact is the stage before our minds experience feelings of like or dislike, because our minds merely come in contact with phenomena without making such distinctions. Another interpretation holds that contact is the juncture at which consciousness, actions, and name and form have all come in contact with one another, joining to work together, spurring the active functioning of our minds. Putting aside these academic distinctions, we can understand contact as the point at which our minds discern phenomena clearly. When the mind does this, feelings of pain and pleasure, along with like and dislike, are produced. This is the seventh link, sensation. When these feelings are produced, craving, or a thirst for things, naturally arises. Craving, the eighth link, means something akin to love in the way we use the word to refer to an attachment to or an obsession with something. In other words, craving is a fixation on what we like. When we crave something, we try to hold on to it and refuse to ever let it go. Conversely, this also implies that we will then try to avoid the things we find unpleasant or undesirable. Clutching what is pleasant and desirable, while also avoiding what we dislike, is the ninth stage, called clinging. Once clinging arises, individuals each begin to regard the same objects with differing feelings, which causes disagreements and conflicts. This is the 10th stage, existence, which means to see things dualistically, sharply discriminating between things as well as between self and other. Because of the presence of this discriminating state of mind, antagonism develops between people, conflicts occur, and miserable suffering may take shape. This is the 11th stage, birth. Birth means the production of suffering. As disappointment overwhelms us because things do not go as we wish, we arrive at aging and death, the 12th stage. This is the painful end of any mental experience, circumstance, or thing that we have craved and to which we have clung. Our experience unfolds moment to moment in this fashion throughout our entire life. The primary cause of disappointment stemming from things not turning out the way we hope is our fundamental ignorance, as discussed above. Ignorance is not knowing the principle of causation that shapes all phenomena. It can also be our indifference to a correct understanding of the world and human life based on the principle of causation. If we can only rid ourselves of this ignorance by setting our minds on the proper track, which means looking at things from the standpoint of causation, our deeds will move in the right direction. Moreover, because the continually unfolding states of our minds will also be set on that right track, our sufferings steadily disappear, and we are able to attain peace of mind. This is the conclusion to which the teaching of the 12 causes and conditions leads us. To summarize, the 12 causes and conditions teach us that our actions in previous lives, motivated by ignorance, shape the totality of our lives, including both our minds and our bodies, and cause our birth in this world as ordinary human beings. If we rid ourselves of ignorance in our present life, from that moment onward our true form of being, our Buddha nature, will naturally come to light. When thinking about the 12 causes and conditions, we should not restrict the meaning of future lives to reincarnation, but also think of our future lives as beginning now, from this point in time onward. If we eliminate our fundamental ignorance and set our minds on the right track, one that is in accord with this universal principle of causation, our future life will become bright and peaceful. Conversely, to the extent that we fail to take these actions, suffering will haunt us no matter how rich we become or how much fame we gain, and our minds will continually revolve among the 6 realms of delusion. In this case, 6 realms refers to the 6 states of mind that were explained in my previous discussion of Chapter 2 of the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. Throughout our discussion of the 12 causes and conditions, we have considered only what we could call the vertical development of our human lives. In other words, linear temporal relationships between our previous lives, our present lives, and our lives in the world to come, as well as between our ancestors, ourselves, and our descendants. But the fact is that our minds and our lives are not composed merely of such vertical relationships. What are called horizontal relationships, complex connections across society and our environment as a whole, also have considerable impact, exerting a substantial influence on our minds and lives. Horizontal relationships are described by the concept of the 10 realms or 10 mindsets, which includes the previously mentioned 6 realms, plus the realms of the 4 types of sages, Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas. Together they comprise the 10 realms, which form the basis of the famous teaching of 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. We will now take this opportunity to explore this important concept, but as it is a little difficult to understand, those who find it complicated may prefer to continue on to page 165 and return to this section when they are more confident of their grasp of the Dharma. 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. This concept of 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought is the main point of the great calming and contemplation, the Mohe Jikwan, a 10-fascicle work in which the Chinese monk Qi, known as the great teacher of Mount Tiantai, systematized various teachings that the Lotus Sutra expresses through imagery and metaphor. Great calming and contemplation was Qi's interpretation of the Lotus Sutra for his day. The Japanese monk Nichiren was of the opinion that, while many people spread the Buddhist teaching after his passing, Qi's concept of the 3,000 worlds in a thought truly conveys the essence of Shakyamuni Buddha's teaching. In the 2nd volume of his work, The Opening of the Eyes, Nichiren highly praises this teaching, writing that, Unless living beings become Buddhas through the principle of 3,000 worlds in a thought, they attain Buddhahood in name only. In the first volume of the same text, he also writes, Tiantai's principle of the 3,000 worlds in a thought is living beings' way to Buddhahood. Nichiren extols this principle dozens of times in his works. What is the principle of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought? As discussed previously, our mind revolves ceaselessly in the 6 realms of existence, which from the emotional and psychological standpoint are 6 states of mind. These are 1. Hells, a mindset of anger. 2. Hungry spirits, a mind of greed. 4. Asuras, antagonism arising from a mind of jealous self-interest. 5. Human beings, a balanced mind that experiences all the deluded mindsets given above, but also manages them to a significant degree. And 6. Heavens, a mindset of temporary joy. As we spin round and round these 6 realms of existence, there is no end to our suffering. But the thoughts and inclinations of the Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Buddhas also arise in the minds of ordinary living beings. Our minds, too, can function like the minds of these 4 kinds of sages. Learning the way of the Buddha is the frame of mind of the Shravakas. Suddenly realizing the proper way intuitively through personal experience is the mind of the Pratyeka Buddha. Aspiring to devote oneself to the good of other living beings and society is the mindset of the Bodhisattva. Living beings can even experience the Buddha's mind of absolute compassion that has forgotten all egotism. How wonderful it would be if we could constantly remain in these states of mind. Yet to our great disappointment, our minds soon return to their former deluded conditions. The mutual inclusion of the 10 realms. People's minds possess the unawakened mindset of both the 6 realms of existence and the 4 realms of the sages. The minds of other kinds of living beings also contain these 10 realms. For example, all 10 realms are present in the minds of heavenly beings in just the same way they are present in the minds of ordinary human beings. This means that all the 10 realms are found within the minds of the beings in each of the 10 realms. In short, the 10 realms are found in one another. This is called the mutual inclusion of the 10 realms. Consequently, the seeds of Buddha nature, the capacity to experience the mind of the Buddha realm, is also possessed by those who are in the hells, the realm of Asuras, and all the other realms. The mutual inclusion of the 10 realms indicates that even living beings who have such deluded minds as these are capable of becoming Buddhas. The possibility of liberation exists everywhere and for everyone. The mutual inclusion of the 10 realms shows us that the compassion of the Buddha extends to all living beings, kindling a bright light of hope that illuminates our hearts. On the other hand, the mutual inclusion of the 10 realms also teaches those of us who assume we are already awakened and have attained considerable liberation from suffering to reflect on the fact that some seeds of delusion remain in our minds. This knowledge should prompt us to dedicate ourselves to still greater practice. In this way, all the realms are present within each of the individual 10 realms that may manifest in our minds. This makes for 10 realms within 10 realms, or, in other words, 10 multiplied by 10. As a result, we arrive at a total of 100 potential realms composing our experience of reality. Furthermore, these 100 realms manifest themselves in 10 modes according to the 10 suchnesses that the Buddha teaches in Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, Skillful Means. The 10 suchnesses. As briefly introduced in Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, the 10 suchnesses are such an appearance, such a nature, such an embodiment, such a potential, such a function, such a cause, such a condition, such an effect, such a reward, and from the first to the last, such an ultimate identity. This principle demonstrates the way in which all things in the universe manifest their existence. The Lotus Sutra calls this the principle of the ultimate reality of all things. As I paraphrase the Buddha's explanation in Chapter 2, the ultimate reality of all things permeates everything that exists and is the principle by which the external appearances, natures, and embodiments of all phenomena manifest in our world. According to this principle, all phenomena have a corresponding appearance, nature, and embodiment. Phenomena also possess their own corresponding potentials and functions, which are their latent capabilities and their activity, respectively. The phenomenon's nature and potential are in harmony with each other, and, as they change in tandem, the function of the phenomenon also changes. becoming a corresponding cause whenever it encounters another phenomenon that interacts with it as a condition. And according to the condition, this interaction produces a corresponding effect, which is an immediate phenomenal result. The principle of ultimate reality also indicates that this effect leaves behind an enduring after effect, which is called its corresponding reward. Finally, all phenomena are always in a corresponding state of ultimate identity with one another, because, whether or not they possess physical form, the way every single thing exists is not only appropriate to the thing itself, but also corresponds to this universal principle. Modern science has analyzed the composition of physical substances to the level of subatomic particles, but the principle of the ultimate reality of all things is especially profound, in that it extends to the realm of the mind. The such in these terms refers to suchness, or tathata in Sanskrit, which indicates a truth that is constant and unchanging, and, in this context, also means such, or thus, as well as invariably or without fail. The following are descriptions of each of the 10 suchnesses. 1. Such an appearance. All things that exist invariably manifest an image or features, such as smells or physical sensation, detectable by our senses. This is called such an appearance. 2. Such a nature. Each existence that appears invariably has its own dispositions and inclinations. These tendencies are called such a nature. 3. Such an embodiment. Everything that possesses a nature invariably has its own unique embodiment. This is called such an embodiment. 4. Such a potential. Everything that is embodied also has abilities and potencies. These capabilities are referred to as such a potential. 5. Such a function. Whatever has potential invariably manifests that potential as actions that work on the outside world. This is called such a function. 6. Such a cause. The universe is filled with innumerable embodied existences, and their outwardly directed functions are interrelated with all things. Nothing in the universe has an isolated existence. All things invariably have complex interconnections with one another. This mutual interaction produces various phenomena. Something that is primarily responsible for the production of a phenomenon is such a cause. 7. Such a condition. Even when a potential cause is present, it will not produce its effect unless it comes in contact with certain conditions. For example, water vapor, the primary cause of frost or dew, is always present in the air. But without the condition of contact with the ground or the leaves of plants, water vapor will not produce frost or dew. These circumstances or requirements, sometimes referred to as secondary causes, are called such a condition. 8. Such an effect. When a cause, such a cause, meets the proper condition, such a condition, it produces a phenomenon, which we call such an effect. 9. Such a reward. An effect is not realized only as an immediate phenomenon, however. It invariably has an influence that lingers like a trace or residue. For instance, the effect of frost forming will give a pleasant feeling to someone who finds the pattern it leaves on the window panes gratifying, while the same effect will give an unpleasant feeling to someone else whose crops have been damaged by it. The function of an effect leaving a lasting influence is called such a reward. Let's stop for a moment and consider cause, condition, effect, and reward in greater detail through an example. Suppose a man has offered his seat on a crowded train to an elderly person who has been left standing. His intention to be kind to others is a potential primary cause that exists in his mind. When this primary cause comes in contact with the circumstantial condition of seeing an older person struggling to stand on the crowded train, it leads to the resulting effect of offering his seat to the elder. Afterward, he feels the contentedness of having done something good for someone else. This is the lasting influence that is called a reward. Reward does not always appear outside oneself. In fact, the reward that arises in one's mind is the most immediate as well as the most important. 10. From the first to the last, such an ultimate identity. The last of the 10 suchnesses shows that the 9 suchnesses discussed thus far are simultaneously present in any phenomenon, equally and integrated, and that together these 10 suchnesses are the ultimate reality of all things. The 9 suchnesses described above occur endlessly in society and our universe as a whole, but they are interconnected in extremely complex ways, such that in many cases ordinary human understanding does not allow us to discern which is a cause and which is an effect. The Buddha teaches that all things manifest by behaving according to this universal principle, so that no thing, no circumstance, and no action violates this truth. Every single thing that exists manifests by presenting all of these 9 suchnesses, from appearance through reward. That is to say, from the first, such an appearance, to the last, such a reward. These 9 suchnesses are inseparable, and despite their differences, from the ultimate standpoint, all 9 are identical with one another in essence, all behaving according to this universal truth. The ultimate integration of the 9 suchnesses is understood as the 10th and final suchness, from the first to the last, such an ultimate identity. The manner in which all things, including human beings, manifest their existence and relate to one another according to this principle of the 10 suchnesses is called the ultimate reality of all things. The 1,000 suchnesses of the 100 realms. The 100 realms, the 10 realms found within each the other, 10 times 10, discussed above, all function in the 10 ways shown by the principle of the 10 suchnesses. This means that within the 100 realms as a whole, there are 1,000 suchnesses. 10 times 100 equals 1,000. These 1,000 functions, or modes of experience, make up the reality of our minds. The threefold life world. Up to this point, we have been discussing reality from the standpoint of an individual, but we must always consider our relationship with the socio-environmental context, or life world, because no one exists isolated from society and the environment. Buddhism teaches 3 ways of thinking about our socio-environmental circumstances. The first is the life world of the 5 aggregates. A detailed explanation would become too complicated, but briefly speaking, this is the mutual influence of living beings' minds on one another. In a narrow sense, the immediate social environment in which we live. The second is the life world of living beings. This is the society in which sentient living beings gather to lead their lives. We can think of the life world of living beings as our society or national community. The third is the life world of the land, which is an entire world consisting of many different societies or countries in relationships both of harmony and strife. It is an absolute fact that living beings all take part in creating these life worlds, which coexist with one another. The 1,000 constituents of our minds discussed above interact with the threefold life world, making for a total of 3,000 constituents of the mind. 1,000 times 3 equals 3,000, or 3,000 worlds, which constitute the entirety of our experience of reality. The relationships of these 3,000 worlds are wholly contained in each and every momentary working of our minds. Hence the term 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Let's consider more examples. Suppose the following thought occurred in someone's mind. That man coming toward me has such a hateful expression on his face. Or imagine that the following idea flashed through another person's mind. The flowers on that hedge are so beautiful. When we analyze these thoughts, we find both the vertical influence on our minds from our cycles of death and rebirth since the remote past, and the horizontal influence of other people, society, and all other things in our present world. A single thought includes both the nature, such a nature, leading us to fall into hells, and the nature to become a Buddha. Just as the nature inclining one to become a Buddha is included within the thought of aversion toward that man's face, so the nature leading one to fall into hells is also included in the appreciation of the beauty of the hedge flower. This may sound strange, but it is actually quite comprehensible. If the thought of aversion develops into the desire to punch that man in the face, then one immediately finds oneself in the mindset of the hells. But one may instead think, wait, this feeling reflects my own lack of spiritual cultivation. I dislike that person because I have the seed of dislike in my mind. I must cultivate more practice in order to remove this seed, delusion, from my mind. If one experienced such a realization, one already has the mind of the Pratyeka Buddha. Moreover, one might firmly believe that a person with that facial expression must have a wound in their heart or some problem in their life. My work as a disciple of the Buddha is to spread his teaching so that there isn't even a single person left in the world with that expression of suffering on their face. People who think like this have the mindset of the Bodhisattva and possess the possibility of attaining the mindset of a Buddha. If one just innocently admires the flower's beauty when one thinks the flower on the hedges are so beautiful, their admiration reflects the mindset of a sage who is one with all things. But if one thinks, I'll pick one and bring it back with me to the place on my desk, then they are beginning to descend into greed and desire, the realm of hungry spirits. Such a person might also angrily brood, I wonder how rich this person is that they can have such a beautiful hedge around their house. They must have an easy life, while I have to work my fingers to the bone. Damn them. If they respond in anger in this way, they have already fallen into the mind of hells. The intellectual understanding of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. The reader may be wondering what, if any, significance the principle of 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought has for their life. Even if we can make sense of this principle, that alone does not produce the power to liberate others or even ourselves. This kind of theoretical grasp is referred to as the intellectual understanding of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Far from liberating ourselves and others, we may become so intellectually captivated by this principle that we worry about the implications of each and every one of our successive thoughts to the point of absurdity. In any event, we have to take this teaching, like all things, with a composed, optimistic, and proactive attitude. The principle of 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought teaches us that we possess the unlimited possibility either to improve ourselves or to regress. If we firmly resolve to put the teachings of the Buddha into practice, we will progress towards the Buddha realm without fail. This knowledge fills our hearts with a powerful sense of hope and expectation. It also demonstrates that in all the universe, there is no single thing or individual that exists independently apart from the whole, and that all things are interconnected like the mesh of a giant net. This awareness brings us to the clear realization that liberation only of oneself, of the lone individual, cannot be true liberation. Practicing 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Grasping the two implications of this principle, not just in our heads, but in the very fiber of our being, naturally transforms our hearts, and we cannot help but putting this knowledge into concrete practice in order to benefit others. This is called practicing 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Unless we realize this principle in this way, it fails to become a living teaching. Nichiren spoke in the highest terms of the principle of the 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought, and derived his own teachings from it. But eventually, he went beyond a simple intellectual understanding because he realized that this knowledge must be translated into faith and practice. Nichiren overcame the limits of mere theory to practice 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought in concrete terms by performing the compassionate liberating work of a Buddha. If we thoroughly understand 3,000 worlds in a thought, our hearts will ache with concern as long as there is even a single suffering person remaining in the world. This concern for others is different from the sympathy felt by ordinary living beings. It is the great empathy of a Buddha, and by extension bodhisattvas, the emissaries of the Buddha who perform the Buddha's liberating work in the world. This is the meaning of the expression from the Vimalakirti Sutra, because living beings are sick, so too is the bodhisattva. Nichiren also expressed the same concern when he wrote of himself in his text, Annotations on the Ultimate Reality of All Things. I, Nichiren, do not weep, but even so, tears of worries for others flow incessantly from my eyes. If we must worry about something, we should have the same worry as the Buddha and Nichiren, the kind of worry that gives us forward-looking courage and helps us find life worth living. There is no work in this world that is nobler than to strive for the liberation of those who are suffering. This is the higher endeavor, elevating humanity. Our own awareness that we play a role in this task, even as small as we are, brightens our lives with optimism. I am convinced that this is how we must practice 3,000 worlds in a moment of thought. Let us return to the text of this chapter. Shakyamuni Buddha continues describing the past events of universal surpassing wisdom, summarized as follows. The Buddha, universal surpassing wisdom, expounded the principles of the Four Noble Truths and the 12 causes and conditions. At that time, innumerable living beings who heard his exposition ceased being swayed by the changes and phenomena around them, no longer attached to all things, and their minds were freed from defilements, thus affording them true agency because they were no longer agitated by anything around them at any time or place. Likewise, when that Buddha repeated the Four Noble Truths and the 12 causes and conditions, expounding them a second, third, and even fourth time, innumerable living beings attained the same state of mind, the enlightenment of the lesser vehicle. Meanwhile, when the 16 princes saw these innumerable living beings freed from their delusions, they renounced home life and became Shamaneras, novice disciples of the Buddha. They had keen natural abilities and, gradually receiving the Buddha's teaching, they came to understand them completely. The princes arrived at the realization that the Four Noble Truths and the 12 causes and conditions are paths leading to the Mahayana teaching, and that in order to attain the true awakening of a Buddha, They must study the Mahayana and practice the way of the Bodhisattva. Therefore, they asked the Buddha, Universal Surpassing Wisdom, to expound the teaching of Supreme Perfect Awakening, the highest awakening of the Buddhas. At that time, many subjects of the wheel-rolling Sage King, the father of the Buddha, Universal Surpassing Wisdom, asked for and received permission to renounce home life. The Buddha consented to the request of his new disciples, and after the long span of 20,000 kalpas, that Buddha finally expounded a sutra called the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, a teaching that instructs bodhisattvas and that Buddhas protect and keep in mind. A teaching that instructs bodhisattvas means, just as literally implied, the Dharma that teaches the bodhisattva way, and the words that Buddhas protect and keep in mind mean that the Buddhas safeguard and meditate on this teaching and expound it only rarely. Both phrases refer to the Lotus Sutra. Shakyamuni Buddha continues his story. When that Buddha had finished his exposition of the sutra, for the sake of attaining supreme perfect awakening, the 16 Shamaneras received and embraced the sutra, believed it in their hearts, personally put its teachings into practice, appreciated it deeply, and furthermore, expounded it to others. There were also those among the other living beings in the assembly who were able to believe and understand the teaching, but most of them had doubts and were confused because they were convinced they could not possibly become Buddhas. The Buddha, Universal Surpassing Wisdom, continued preaching this sutra without a single pause for the long stretch of 8,000 kalpas. After this time had passed, he secluded himself in a quiet room and remained in meditation for an immense span of 84,000 kalpas. Seeing the Buddha withdraw in this way, the 16 Shamaneras were concerned about what would happen to the world if they did not share the Dharma on behalf of that Buddha. Each of them ascended the seat of the Dharma and taught the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, expounding it distinctively according to the capacity of their listeners. Each of the 16 Shamaneras showed, taught, benefited, delighted, and led myriads of living beings to aspire to supreme perfect awakening. Show, teach, benefit, and delight. A brief explanation should be given for the line in the text of the sutra that reads, each showed, taught, benefited, delighted, and led the myriads of living beings to aspire to supreme perfect awakening. The words show, teach, benefit, and delight in this passage indicate the sequence for teaching the Dharma. First, a bodhisattva shows people the basic principle of the teaching. Then, when the desire to enter the teaching is clearly stirring within their hearts, a bodhisattva should teach its profound meaning. Next, judging that people have gained a basic understanding, a bodhisattva leads them to put it into practice so they can obtain its benefits. Lastly, a bodhisattva encourages people to continually uphold the teachings of the Dharma, such that doing so becomes the delight of their lives. This is a truly practical order for teaching the Dharma, and when we ourselves disseminate the Buddha Dharma, this method is the best path for us to take. Shakyamuni carries on with his story. The Buddha, Universal Surpassing Wisdom, finally arose from his meditation after 84,000 kalpas, went to the Dharma seat, and quietly sat down. Addressing the great assembly, he said, "These 16 Shamaneras are rare, remarkable people. Since their past lives of long ago, they have revered infinite numbers of Buddhas, practiced ceaselessly under the direction of those Buddhas, received and embraced the knowledge and insight of the Tathagatas, and expounded it to living beings, and led them to enter it. All of you should draw close to them and put their teachings into practice. Why? If you do, those of you who are Shravakas or Pratyeka Buddhas, as well as those who are Bodhisattvas, will be able to attain the Tathagata wisdom that is supreme perfect awakening." Then Shakyamuni Buddha, changing his tone, addressed all the monks, saying, "Those 16 Bodhisattvas always delight in expounding the teachings of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma. The innumerable living beings whom each of these Bodhisattvas taught and transformed have been reborn time and time again together with those Bodhisattvas, and having heard the Dharma from them in more than just a single lifetime, have all come to fully believe in it and understand it. Because of these connections stemming from events in the past, those living beings have been able to meet 40,000 million Buddhas, and they continue to do so even at the present time. The Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma is more than the title of a specific book. At this point, a word of caution is in order. Some people are puzzled by Shakyamuni Buddha's story of how the Buddha, Universal Surpassing Wisdom, and the 16 Bodhisattvas have already taught the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma in the past. Readers may be confused because this chapter comes early in the Lotus Sutra. It is only the 7th exposition of the Dharma, and Shakyamuni Buddha has not yet finished expounding the entire sutra. Even some Buddha scholars find it implausible that the Lotus Sutra could have been taught in the distant past. This is a misunderstanding, however, that stems from the mistaken idea that the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, like the title of a specific book, is a proper noun indicating a particular thing. But this is not the case. The title, Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, signifies the precious, supreme teaching of truth that allows living beings to live untainted in this impure world, and also leads them to Buddhahood. Ultimate truth is always one. There cannot be 2 or 3 ultimate truths. Therefore, Shakyamuni's story about the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom and the 16 Bodhisattvas expounding the Lotus Sutra in the past isn't strange at all. The truth has existed since the infinite past, before the manifest Buddha appeared in our world, and the enlightenment attained by a truly awakened person can only be a realization of this single truth. We should not be surprised that some hundreds of thousands of people shared this truth across the vast expanse of time. Moreover, Shakyamuni Buddha's intention to completely convince us of the oneness of truth is evident in this passage. Having concluded the story of the events in the life of the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom, Shakyamuni Buddha elevates his voice and shocks the assembly with the following revelation. Everyone, listen carefully to my words, because I'm going to tell you something extremely important. Those 16 Bodhisattvas who were the disciples of the Buddha universal surpassing wisdom all later became Buddhas, and, even now, they continue expounding the Dharma in domains throughout the universe. The World-Honored One then indicates the names of each of those Buddhas and the domains where they teach. With the 9th Buddha, a name with which many Buddhists are quite familiar appears in the text of the sutra. 2 of those Shamaneras became Buddhas in the western quarter, one called Amitabha. Amitabha is the Buddha of a domain located some hundreds of thousands of millions of domains to the west of us, where he teaches and transforms the living beings of that world. Finally, reaching the very end of this list of the 16 Buddhas in the text of the sutra, the World-Honored One declares, the 16th Buddha became none other than me, Shakyamuni Buddha, attainer of supreme perfect awakening in the Saha domain. With these words, Shakyamuni Buddha reveals for the first time the causes and conditions of his own awakening, which stemmed from his past lives through his final birth. We should note Shakyamuni Buddha's declaration that he is the Buddha who has accomplished supreme perfect awakening in the Saha domain. Having attained realization here in our world, Shakyamuni Buddha alone is the great teacher for us living beings of the Saha world. This passage reminds us once again just how important and essential the manifest Buddha Shakyamuni is to us. On the other hand, what we call the eternal original Buddha is, as universal truth itself, the ultimate cause of the manifest Buddha. Without beginning or end, the eternal original Buddha is present at all times, everywhere in the universe. These 2 Buddhas, the manifest Buddha and the eternal original Buddha, are one, but are Buddhas in differing senses. Unless we understand this truth, we will not be able to make sense of Shakyamuni's words. The Buddha continues this surprising revelation. When we 16 princes were Shamaneras, each of us taught and transformed infinite numbers of living beings, and many of them were able to attain supreme perfect awakening. But among these living beings are some who still remain at the stage of Shravakas. I continually teach and transform these living beings so that they also may reach supreme perfect awakening. These living beings will also be able to gradually enter the way of the Buddha through the teaching of the great vehicle. Why do I say gradually? Because the wisdom of the Buddha is too profound for people to believe and understand if I teach it in its fullness all at once. Therefore, living beings gradually progress from basic teachings to those that are more profound. In this way, in previous lives since the distant past, I have led infinite numbers of living beings, and those whom I taught and transformed are actually none other than you yourselves, who are hearing the Dharma from me now, as well as those who will be my disciples in future ages to come after I pass away. At this point, our conception of the Buddha will be confused unless we discern the difference between the manifest Buddha and the original Buddha. Chapter 16, The Lifespan of the Eternal Tathagata, discusses this difference in detail. See pages 30 to 32, where this distinction was explained in brief. The Buddha continues, "After I pass away, there will be followers of mine who, without coming in contact with this great vehicle teaching and unaware of the practices of the Bodhisattva, will be content with simply attaining the peaceful state of mind from their own delusions. At that time, I will have become Buddhas in different domains and under different names. But those people will find their way to those lands of my abode because, even though they may not now know it consciously, they will actually be seeking the knowledge and insight out of the Tathagatas, and will be able to hear the supreme teaching from me. Only by the supreme teaching of the one Buddha vehicle will they attain the awakening that is true extinguishment. Although the Buddha's expositions of skillful means each have their various purposes, do not think of them as different vehicles." This teaching is also extremely important. Buddhahood, that is, attaining the ideal state of mind as a human being, cannot be fully realized by the cultivation of practice in just our present life or even the next. Some people will be able to become Buddhas in this life, but such people have practiced the Buddha way for many previous lives. As stated above, our spiritual cultivation continues perpetually, and even if we do not attain Buddhahood in this life, if we continuously receive the teachings of the Buddha in future lives and devote ourselves to the Bodhisattva way of working to liberate others, we can eventually become Buddhas. People who come in contact with the Buddha way in this life produce a condition, the circumstances or requirements sometimes called a secondary cause, as discussed above, for the attainment of Buddhahood, the primary cause being one's own Buddha nature. Those who can perfectly practice the Bodhisattva way in this life have already passed through the mindsets of the Sravaka or Pratyeka Buddha. In any case, people who have encountered the Lotus Sutra as readers have already generated the conditions for attaining Buddhahood in the future. They should receive and continue to embrace this sutra for the rest of their lives and beyond. The Buddha continues, "Everyone, I, the manifest Buddha, will not abide in this world indefinitely. Once the Buddha expounds their teachings completely, they soon depart from the world, entering nirvana. When a Buddha recognizes that this time has come, and when the living beings in their assembly have firm faith and understanding, and comprehend the teaching of emptiness, which is the principle of equality among living beings, and when their minds have attained a secure state of immovable meditation, a Buddha will gather together all their bodhisattvas and Shravaka disciples to teach the lotus flower of the wondrous Dharma to them. There are no two paths by which one can attain the true awakening of real extinguishment. There is only one way, the one Buddha vehicle. But the Buddha undertakes skillful means, that is to say, practical methods he uses to lead living beings based on thoroughly perceiving and distinguishing their natures and capacities. The Buddha knows there are living beings who prefer basic teachings and are unaware of those that are more profound, and he knows that there are living beings deeply attached to the pleasures of the five senses, who bring about their own suffering. For these living beings he first teaches nirvana, leading them to attain peace of mind by removing their delusions. This is the most suitable teaching for people at that stage, and if they are skillfully taught, they will invariably believe and accept it. In order to explain this by use of a parable, I will tell the following story. The parable of the Conjured City. Next, the Buddha tells the well-known parable of the Conjured City, the fourth of the Lotus Sutra's 7 parables. The basic story of the parable is as follows. Imagine a steep and perilous road stretching 500 yojanas long through an extremely terrifying and remote region where dangerous wild animals and other threats frequently appear. Despite these hazards, there is a large group of people who want to take that road to seek some rare treasures. There is a guide among them, a person of superior wisdom and insight, who is so familiar with the perilous road that he knows far ahead where the road is passable and where it is blocked. This guide leads the large group that wishes to make the journey through this wilderness, but in the party there are travelers who are limping along and still others who are impatient, and growing totally exhausted, they turn to their guide and say, "We are completely worn out, and this road is so scary that we can go no further. The road ahead is still long, so we want to turn back." The guide is well acquainted with the methods for leading people in accord with the circumstances, so he thinks, "I can't help feeling sorry for these people. How can they turn their back and give up on attaining such a great treasure that is within their reach?" With this thought, he uses his power of skillful means to conjure a large city at a point some 300 yojanas along the road, just beyond the halfway point on their journey, and he turns to all the party and says, "Everyone, there is no longer any reason to be afraid. You need not turn back. You can enter that great city up ahead, stop and rest, and do as you please. If you enter the city, you will find total peace and comfort, and once you are fully rested, you will be able to continue on to obtain the treasure. After that, you can return home." The exhausted party is overjoyed, and they proceed to enter the Conjured City and rest themselves. When the guide sees that they have completely recovered from their fatigue, he makes the Conjured City disappear, and encouraging them onward, he says, "Come on, all of you, let's go. The location of the treasure is close at hand. The great city that was here was actually just something I created for the time being so that you could rest." The guide encourages all in the party in this fashion, and he sets out once again, succeeding in leading them to the place where the treasure awaits. Meaning of the parable. After finishing this parable, Shakyamuni explains its meaning in detail by first commenting, "The Tathagata is just like this guide." What the Buddha is telling us here is that the Tathagata knows the hard road that is made up of our delusions and never-ending rounds of birth and death, recognizing its perils and terrors, and seeks to liberate all living beings from them. The Buddha also knows that if he expounds the supreme teaching of the one Buddha vehicle from the very beginning, people will be discouraged, thinking that it is so far removed from their present state of being that they will have no desire to see, draw close to, or become familiar with the Buddha. Living beings will also dejectedly conclude that the way to Buddhahood is too long and requires so much suffering and toil that it is impossible for them to make it far. Therefore, the Buddha employs the power of skillful means, teaching two types of nirvana, the nirvana of the Shravaka and the nirvana of the Pratyeka Buddha, as places to rest along the way in order to give them temporary peace and comfort. Then, seeing that they have sufficiently achieved peace of mind, he leads them to supreme perfect awakening. There is truly only the one Buddha vehicle, but the Buddha teaches the two vehicles of the Shravaka and the Pratyeka Buddha as resting places along the way, just like the guide in this parable. These two kinds of awakening hold precious significance as stages, skillful means, on the way to the one Buddha vehicle. But what we understand from this parable is that we must not remain at these two levels. Chapter 7, the parable of the Conjured City, comes to a conclusion with a section of verse in which the Buddha restates his Dharma exposition.